Story 1. Where do I even start? One story that stands out. I had sewn a dress for my daughter, and she was wearing it during a visit to my grandmother. Our conversation went like this. Grandmother. I had an aunt who used to make beautiful clothes. When we visited her, she always had a beautiful dress she had made to give to me. Me, that's nice. Where did she live? Grandmother, in a mental home. Me, oh, okay. Grandmother. Yes. She came home from work one day and found her husband in bed with his sister. So she tried to kill them both, and they had her locked up. Me. Many conversations with my grandmother went that way. Story 2. The real reason my parents got divorced was because my dad broke my sister's arm. They both just said they fell out of love. Story 3. I was adopted and made contact with my biological family as an adult. My brother, who was not adopted out, gave me the rundown of our father, who was apparently a nightmare person. He was an alcoholic who killed someone with his car. At some point, his license was suspended, and he made my 12-year-old brother drive him around. He became angry at a girlfriend and burned her house down, trying to burn her inside it. We have a sister who is 5 years younger, and she is the product of him returning and raping our mother. He died from falling asleep at the wheel one morning after drinking all night. He was in his early 30s and had 8 children by 4 different women. After he died, my brother came home from school at age 14 and found that his father's former girlfriend took her 3 kids and abandoned the house without warning. My brother came home to a completely empty house. It is crazy to realize I am directly related to a raging, angry alcoholic who destroyed so many lives in his wake. I do not feel any of it inside of me and do not see it in my siblings either. Story 4. I found out recently that my father pushed my mother down a flight of stairs when she was pregnant with me. It has been hard to talk to him since. Story 5. My ancestors were mostly Russian peasants, but one of my great-grandmothers was Polish. She was the daughter of a nobleman and a maid. She lived with her father as an illegitimate child and one day ran away to Russia with a Russian peasant, starting her life from scratch. Also, a couple of years ago, I found out that my grandfather had a brother. His brother went missing during World War II, and my grandfather sent many letters to different departments to find out what had happened to him. My grandfather died in 2007 and never knew where his brother was buried. Now, I was able to do some research online and found his tomb. He died during one of the most severe battles of the war, the Battle of Stalingrad, 2 weeks before the Nazis were defeated there. Story 6. My uncle had schizophrenia and used many drugs. I recently learned that he grew his own poppies to make more drugs. He took his own life after a doctor said there was nothing wrong with him. He also died on my dad's birthday. Story 7. My great-grandfather was stationed in my hometown where he met my great-grandmother. She was very poor. As a child, I thought there was some romantic love story, perhaps that he had swept her off her feet. A love that transcended cultures. I later learned that he was in his 50s and she was 12. Gross. Story 8. My grandmother was in her late 40s when my mother was born. She had 6 other children, with a 12-year gap between her and the second youngest. We believe there is a good chance one of the teenage daughters was her real mother and that it was covered up. In 1960s Ireland, the alternative would likely have been to send her to a Magdalene laundry. Story 9. From Ireland, my grandmother had 11 living children plus several miscarriages and stillbirths. They had no money and my grandfather was a violent alcoholic. My grandmother spent time in a mental health hospital in her 50s. I found out that she had written to the bishop in the 1960s pleading her case for dispensation to use contraception, and he refused it. It makes my blood boil. Story 10. I was spending a couple of days at my cousin's place, which is something I got to do a few times as a child. Think of it as an extended sleepover. My cousin's father was elderly and already retired. He had taken up painting as a hobby. Once, when I was there, he was painting one of my grandmother's brothers. He always painted from photos. They had given him a photo of this man in a military uniform, but he refused to paint him in that uniform. I had not even known that my grandmother had another brother who did not come home from the war. My cousin's father then painted that man in a uniform but left out the national emblems. I wish I knew where that painting is so I could take a photo of it. He changed the uniform because it was a Schutzstaffel uniform. As a child, I had no idea what that really meant. Story 11. There is a town in South Carolina that shares my last name. Although I am a white man, 80% of the town's population is African American. The town conducted a genome project, and I am related to about 60 to 70% of the population in some way. This is because the town was originally my ancestor's personal plantation, which he purchased with money made from being a slave trader. He and his son also committed numerous sexual assaults against their enslaved people. We are working to make amends in any way we can. I am grateful to the current residents of the town for their grace and forgiveness. Story 12. At my grandmother's brother-in-law's funeral, I learned he had a baby brother who was shot in the head while in his arms as they were fleeing during or after World War II. Just to clarify, the baby brother was a child at that time. I cannot even imagine the horror. Story 13. My great-grandmother and two of my great-great-grandmothers went to jail for murder, all for killing their husbands. My late husband's family gave me some very funny looks after that information came out. Story 14. A few years ago, my father made a book about his family and ancestors. He found out that his father, my grandfather, was previously engaged to a girl other than my grandmother. He was sent to France to work for the Germans during World War II. When he was on leave, he decided not to return and needed to find shelter to hide from the Nazis. His parents-in-law were apparently with the Nazis and decided to betray him by telling them where he was. He had to run and hide again and remained in hiding for the rest of the war. That is where he met my grandmother, who brought groceries to several places where people were hiding. They got married a year after the war and had children. Here I am. Story 15. My mother was from the Philippines and was a child prostitute in the 1970s. Her education was only up to the equivalent of grade 5 or 6. My half-brother is the result of a client assaulting her when she was 16. She left with the help of a cousin and settled in Las Vegas for a time. I believe my father met my mother through that cousin, as he was known to hire prostitutes in the past, and there is no other reasonable way the two would have met. Story 16. My great-grandmother was a victim of human trafficking as a child. We are from an African country. At the time, slavery had recently been abolished, but this illegal activity was still common. She was at the beach with her two brothers when they were kidnapped by two men. The brothers were sold off during the journey. She was rescued when they arrived at an administrative village in the region. The people were suspicious of the two men walking with a child, who used a cover story of being her uncles. Reports were made, and they questioned her, to which she told them the truth about what had happened. The men were imprisoned, but unfortunately, due to her young age and the restrictions at the time, she was not able to say where she was from. She was raised and worked in the backyard of the village's administrative post. Years later, her great-grandfather arrived in the village for business, met her, and married her. Later in life, she committed suicide. It was said that she was a drunk and suffered from deep depression, probably due to the trauma. Story 17. After my parents both died, I found a box of photos my father had taken during his extensive work travels. Among them were photographs of a beautiful naked woman posing naturally, almost candidly, in a rumpled bed. The photos of the woman were bundled together inside an envelope with a printed return address of my father's employer. The whole thing was wrapped several times with string, the envelope folded tightly around the photos. Warnings not to open were written on the envelope in his handwriting. The woman in the photos is not my mother. Story 18. In high school, we were introduced to a site where we could search for our family names, which was easier if you had a somewhat unusual name. I found one of my ancestors. The website provided the birth year, place of birth, where he lived and died, and occupation. The part that surprised me was that under occupation it just said, insane. I discovered that I had a mentally ill ancestor that way. Story 19. My ancestors came over during the Irish famine. They were segregated to the slums. One day, one of them fell out of a window and died. but the family could not find an Irish gravedigger to bury her in an Irish cemetery. At that time, Irish people were not allowed to be buried in normal cemeteries, so they had to have their own. Her body lay on the sidewalk decomposing for several days. Every day, her young child dragged his stool to the window because he could not reach it, to see if his mother's body had been picked up yet. Story 20. Less disturbing, but just tragic. A paternal relative who was 13 years old during the Great Depression fell off a work truck, went into a coma lasting months, and passed away at 14 years old. Story 21. My grandpa's first wife had a lobotomy due to her alcoholism and postpartum depression. She did not die, but apparently it made her condition worse. She killed herself by overdosing on prescription medication. She and my grandpa had 4 sons, and they all have fetal alcohol syndrome. One is deceased, one is addicted to drugs, and the other 2 are doing okay. I have never met them. My grandpa completely abandoned his sons when he married my grandma. He took on her 2 sons, my dad and uncle, as his own. I had no idea he was not my biological grandpa until he died when I was 15. Story 22. One parent was sold to my grandparents in a shady backdoor deal over a poker game. It is not really disturbing but a little shocking to hear. Story 23. My grandmother was married and had 7 daughters. He pushed my mom, who was 13, down the stairs, so my grandmother told him to leave. He could beat her but was never allowed to hurt the girls. He left and never returned. We found out a few years ago that he died alone in Florida but kept claiming the girls on his tax returns. Apparently, he was involved with the mafia and owed money to loan sharks. The mafia came and took all the furniture from their house. It is strange because to this day we do not know how my grandmother supported the 7 girls. The youngest was 2 years old when he left, and the oldest was 15. She worked part-time at a diner for a few years but always had a home. Story 24. My grandmother had 3 grandparents who were first cousins. They were all related to a mass murderer. Story 25. I have a strong suspicion that they are not as many generations away from the chimpanzees as they should be. Story 26. My 4 times great-grandfather killed a man in a duel in the south of France and came to America a few years after the American Civil War. Story 27. This is all alleged since, sadly, my parents and all my aunts and uncles are deceased now. The belief is that my paternal grandparents, immigrants from Italy who settled in Virginia where my grandfather was a coal miner, lived on a small farm with their 6 children. They had to quickly leave the state and move elsewhere because my grandfather killed a man. Why did he kill him? He raped my grandmother, and she became pregnant as a result. My aunt has a different man's name on her birth certificate. She was never treated differently from the other children, as far as I am aware. My father was born after all this happened. I honestly do not think he ever knew about this situation. My grandfather died when this aunt was 10 and my father was 8, so everything was kind of swept under the rug, as was common at the time. That aunt never married and was very devoted to my grandmother. By the time I heard about this, the aunts who were still living were well into their 80s and in poor health, so I suppose we will never know the true story. It makes me sad to think of the shame my grandmother endured because this took place in the mid-1920s. She had no support as all her relatives were still in Italy, and living on a farm, she was quite isolated. Story 28. Found out that my great-aunt's son was the Temple operating system developer. Edit was not is. He passed away a few years ago. Story 29. Not necessarily disturbing, but my mum randomly mentioned that her grandmother on her dad's side ran multiple brothels in the late 1800s. When she married my great-grandfather, he took her last name to cover up the fact that his parents were well-known criminals with books written about them. Story 30. Not necessarily my parents, but a disturbing factor of my upbringing. We lived in a cul-de-sac when I was in middle school. All of the parents got along and so did all of us kids. Parents would have couples nights at each other's houses, and all of us kids went to school and played together. One year, the parents started shunning me. The moms would make snide comments that I didn't understand. Slowly, the kids stopped hanging out with me. I found out years later that all of the parents were swinging, and my parents said no, so we were exiled by the group. I was shocked, but it all made sense in hindsight. Story 31. I found out my great-great-grandfather was a head nurse in the biggest asylum in South America. I discovered this shortly after my daughter had been in the psychiatric ward, so it was quite disturbing at the time. Story 32. In Australia in 1996, there was a massacre which led to tighter gun laws being introduced, including a gun buyback where people could surrender firearms to the local police station without penalty during a specific window of time. Around this time, my step-grandfather was diagnosed with throat cancer and hospitalized. My grandmother, having heard about the gun buyback, asked my dad to come over and sort through his belongings to see if he had any guns. My dad brought my sibling and me along to spend time with my grandmother. Dad had a better understanding of my step-grandfather than I did at the time. He kept us sheltered, and I was shocked to see my dad walking out of his home office repeatedly with armfuls of weapons. Rifles, handguns, and more. There were also army paraphernalia and World War II artifacts, as well as about 60 books of the war stories for boys variety. I asked if my step-grandfather had served in World War II. He had not. He never served but had a strange fixation with the military and an excessive number of guns for a man living in suburbia with no need for hunting or using firearms. Later, I learned that he had been horribly abusive to my grandmother, my aunt, and my father, including leaving them unattended for hours at the pub while he pursued other women and forcing them to sit under the table on the beer-soaked floor. He regularly hit and verbally abused them. We are incredibly lucky that despite his gun obsession, he never used one against them. Story 33. I found out my grandfather had a second family no one knew about. He kept the two lives going for decades. Family reunions became very awkward very quickly. Story 34. Apparently, one of my ancestors had a pig farm and an inn on a major trade route. The pigs were always well-fed, and the ancestors seemed much wealthier than a typical pig farmer and innkeeper. Story 35. Going back 40 years, my great-aunt was in a relationship with a man who was extremely violent. They had been together for years and were always toxic toward each other. This man had told my great-aunt she could do whatever she wanted, but if he ever found out she was cheating, he would kill her. She did not take the threat seriously. One day, he came home early from work and saw a car outside the house. He went inside and found my great-aunt on the sofa with another man. He lost control and, from somewhere unknown to the family, he produced a sawn-off shotgun. My great-aunt tried to run for the stairs, but he caught her at the bottom. According to my grandmother, once he caught her, he said, "I told you I would kill you if you ever did this to me," before putting the shotgun under her chin and killing her. For some reason, he left the man alone. He left the house and was arrested later that day. Story 36. After reading some replies, I had to think about how my parents met. My mother became pregnant by her previous boyfriend, and abortion was illegal at that time in my country. There were illegal abortions, but only in the capital, so she went there to work about 400 kilometers away. She met my father at work in a restaurant, and he accompanied her to the abortion. When I was 13 or 14, he mentioned being unable to eat or cook rabbit because it reminded him of what he saw during the abortion. It was not until many years later that I connected the dots and realized how far along my mother must have been. Story 37. I can't really choose one. There was a barber surgeon in London in the 1700s. Records show he used an alias to operate under the radar, and his daughter also used an alias. Their real names and aliases indicated they were father and daughter. I assume she helped him at work. There are no records of them being convicted or involved in botched abortions, but the aliases suggest possible criminal activity. I don't think people worried about trouble just for pulling rotten teeth. Another man went on a drunken rampage, spied on women like Peeping Tom, and killed a policeman. He was committed for insanity rather than guilt and lived happily after. He became an artist in the asylum and was glad not to work. Two others were committed to asylums separately. One was allowed to visit family, while the other was forced into a divorce and not allowed to see their children again. Story 38. My grandfather, the most wonderful, loving, kind grandpa a little girl could hope for, was the chief of detectives in my county. It was a big county. He was an important figure. He died when I was 6. In adulthood, I became aware that the local police department is notoriously corrupt. There has been more research and reporting on it in recent years, triggered by a serial killer and a very corrupt chief. Although this is well after my grandfather's time, it has led to in-depth examinations of the past. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was up to a 90% confession rate. That is not statistically probable. Police generally get around 60% or less, even with poor work and standard coercion. 90%? How? Probably lies, torture, and abuse. At the very least, it was known to and more likely condoned and actively organized by my grandfather. I will never know the truth. I think most people who would know are gone, and I do not want to go looking. I am glad I did not hear about it until 40 years later. I can still love and treasure him. But my God, what did he do? This is actually far more shocking to me than the surprise older brother I have. My parents had a baby as teenagers and could not keep him. It is sad and strange that they did not or were too traumatized to tell us until I was in my 40s, but that it happened is not shocking. He is great, and we love him, so it is fine, though I am still sad for my parents. Story 39. I'm late to the party. I hope I don't get buried. I found out my great-great-grandmother was Native American. The story I was always told was that the good Mormon pioneers found her after she was abandoned. God intervened for her. It wasn't until I was much older that it became apparent, given how Native people have been treated in this country, that the likelihood of her being abandoned is slim. Either her family was killed or she was stolen. The part that really messes with me is that her children, she had 8 after being married off to an older man very young, cut ties with her completely. They were white passing in a world that looked down upon their mother. She died alone and in poverty and is in a grave that has never had a headstone. It breaks my heart for her. No family. Alone even in death after all these years. Her stolen culture. It especially makes me ache because I don't have a relationship with my mother. It makes me think about time and how I wish we could have known each other. I know it sounds like great-great-grandmother is so far back, but I knew my great-great-grandmother on my mother's side. She died when I was 20 at 104. Mormons have kids young. I hope someday to put a headstone on her grave and honor her in ways life didn't. She's not forgotten, and she is loved. Story 40. I have a number of famous people on my father's side, not for good reasons. 6 governors, all in the southern United States. One was the governor of South Carolina during the Civil War. Not the one who succeeded, not the one who rejoined, but the one in the middle. He was a straight-up Southern racist. His wife is on the Confederate dollar bill. They owned slaves and had a plantation, giving them all our last name. So, whole graveyards of people with our last name were owned by that side of the family. The plantation was burned down, and all that family's children died. There are no descendants on that branch. It ended there. Yet even now, I have met secessionist-minded people who recognize my maiden name and revere it. When they learn my family history, they become fanatical about it. Those of us who remain are, for the most part, very ashamed of those people and truly horrified, some to the point of wanting to make amends and publicly apologize. Even though we are not a direct line, more like an uncle and cousins from over 100 years ago, what they did and were involved in is top-level horror. The one we are descended from was a brigadier general in the Revolutionary War and the person on whom the movie The Patriot was based. So there is that at least. Story 41. My aunt had a child while quite young who was put up for adoption. I have not joined any of the DNA registries to find out where they are, but knowing that the majority of that side of the family is unusual, I have always wondered how they turned out being separated from the rest of us. I am curious to see the contrasts in their life of nature versus nurture. Story 42. Not really discovered. Since I was old enough to be included at the adult dinner table when the whole family got together, I learned pretty quickly. Both sets of my dad's grandparents immigrated from Germany. One set did so many years before the World Wars, and the other set after the Nazi Party took power between World War I and World War II. The set that immigrated between the world wars had younger siblings they kept in contact with. They slowly watched as the Nazi Party schooling system indoctrinated their youngest siblings with misinformation about the Jewish people. Their older siblings who stayed in Germany knew better, but they were drafted for the war against Poland and were told by Nazi recruiters that dodging the draft would result in death. Needless to say, both sets of grandparents decided that German would die as a language for their family when they passed away. Even when my grandmother asked to be taught German, she was scolded and told that it would never happen. Story 43. Apparently, my great-great-grandparents immigrated because the local civilians killed their entire family. Story 44. I had heard that an ancestor was involved with the Texas Rangers during the 1800s. I always thought of them as just a police force or something like that. Then I did a little research on them. Their entire original mission was to eliminate indigenous peoples and Mexicans. By eliminate, I mean genocide. Nothing to be proud of. Story 45. My father is one of 13 living siblings. There were 14 originally, but one was stillborn or died young. They were very poor. The girls slept in a room inside the house, and the boys slept outside in tents. As the children reached adolescence, a few of the brothers would take turns going into one of the sisters' beds with her to have sex. My father was so repulsed by this that when he grew up, he moved to another town and started a new life away from his family. I only found this out in my late 20s. He always denied being related to our family from that town. It turns out his son, who is my father, had similar tendencies. My earliest memory of him waking me up was when I was 5, through violent sexual assault. He died when I was 9, thankfully. I am deeply repulsed by even the thought of incest relationships and abuse. I changed my last name when I was married and live in a different town. It sickens me to know I have any blood relation capable of such acts. I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from what my father did to me. Story 46. Not so much something I discovered as a weird family mystery. My great-grandmother casually mentioned once that her then-deceased husband had been in jail before they were married. My grandmother and her sister were naturally intrigued, but she never said more about it. My great-grandfather had Chicago Irish mob connections when my grandmother was young in the 1940s, and he was probably in jail in the late 1920s. We have scoured public records and ancestry sites and cannot figure out when or why this happened. We all assume it was related to Prohibition, but he likely used a false name. He had at least one other false name we knew of. For all we know, we never actually knew his real name. Story 47. My father was a neo-Nazi who received a dishonorable discharge for striking the face of a black officer with the butt of his rifle. He also apparently engaged in racist violence in his younger years. Suffice to say, his passing was not a sad occasion for us. Story 48. My ancestors were slave owners in the United States. We are white and have been here long enough that I have ancestors who fought on both sides of the United States Revolutionary War. I figured there was some terrible history in my bloodline. One of my cousins is very interested in genealogy. He found a copy of my great-great-grandmother's will, in which she bequeathed a feather mattress and 2 black children to another relative. This is deeply disturbing. I think of her every time I donate money to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Story 49. My aunt and uncle were divorced when I was little. I never knew why. When I got older, I learned it was because my uncle had a fondness for sex workers. They were divorced for several years. My uncle did a lot of therapy and worked on himself. He did a lot of apologizing, and eventually my aunt and uncle got back together. They have been remarried for about 30 years and have a great marriage now. I am proud of my aunt for being strong enough to leave him when the truth came out. I am also proud of my uncle for working on himself, addressing his issues and fixing his marriage. Story 50. My mother used to get into fistfights with other women, fight fiercely, and never ended up in jail. I did not find out about this until my 30s. It is disturbing to know how she is now. Story 51. My great-grandmother became pregnant unmarried at age 18. Her wealthy parents disinherited her, so she had no choice but to marry the father of the baby, my grandparent. Neither of them was faithful, and it is well known within our family that she had more than one back alley abortion. She left her abusive husband but became pregnant again very shortly after. She kept this baby. As a single parent in the 1930s, you would expect her to struggle, but she was never poor. It turned out the new baby was fathered by a rich, married businessman, and she blackmailed him for years, gathering wealth. World War II began, and she decided that parenting was not her thing, so she abandoned her children with her parents, whom my grandparent and the baby had never met, to join the war effort. She drove an ambulance during the Blitz. After the war was over, she decided that she was not going back to her children, so she traveled the world trading in cut and uncut gemstones. She never returned to her parents and children but left many fascinating stories behind, including very dodgy businesses. She developed dementia and ended up living with my grandparent for a number of years. We doubted many of her stories until after she died, when we found photographs she had kept. Despite all the illegal dealings and child abandonment, she is kind of my hero. Story 52. My ancestor murdered his wife and was then used by William Marwood to test a new hanging method. Nowadays, he is part of the tour at Lincoln Castle. We do not advocate murdering wives in our family in the 21st century. Story 53. I knew my grandfather left my grandmother, my mother, and her 5 siblings. I did not know the full scope until I found newspaper articles and information about his life. He staged a robbery and kidnapping at the store he managed. His car was found in another state. Everyone feared the worst. The truth is that he left to meet another woman. They met, married, and he became the deacon of the church. He was hailed as a wonderful stepfather. I make sure anyone who adds his name to their family tree also sees who he abandoned. I wanted the family he joined to know that he left a literal baby and toddlers behind to be a great family man and devoted churchgoer. My mother gave up her plans to make sure the children could eat. All of the children suffered greatly because of their father's selfishness, including one, the baby, who died young from mental health struggles and drug issues. Story 54. I had a relative who worked directly with Winston Churchill. She had a brother who died by suicide and a grandson who killed his mother, her daughter. Tragic. Story 55. My family apparently just abandons the deceased for the most part. Things I found out in my 30s. My maternal grandmother's father cut off his own arm using a chainsaw because he couldn't wait 15 minutes for my grandfather to get there to help him cut a tree branch. Recently, I learned that my paternal grandmother had at least 2 brothers I didn't know about. One died after being jumped in a bar while on leave from the military. The other died with their father by getting hit by a train. She also apparently had a sister, but I have no idea about the circumstances of her death, only that she had been married and buried near my grandparents. I grew up thinking she only had one brother and no other siblings. My maternal grandmother had a sister who died young, but I have no idea what happened or how young she was, under 10, under 20, or under 30. No clue. Her name was Rose, and I only know that much because I found an engraved necklace in a play jewelry box. Grandma just said it belonged to her sister who was no longer with us. I also found out that my maternal grandmother grew up very poor because someone who grew up with her described their childhoods. Story 56. My grandfather lost all the family business assets because he was prosecuted for illegal business practices. Had this not happened, our lives would be much easier. Story 57. That my grandfather molested my grandmother's little sister, and that my father knew about it for years. As an adult, he believed his father when he said she was coming on to him. She was 10 years old. I thought finding out my father cheated on my mother was going to be the main point of disappointment with regards to him, but he is always full of new ways to depress me, it seems. Story 58. I am related to several prominent Confederate figures. Some of them have statues. I think it is not the worst thing. Many Americans are related to these people, but it was definitely disturbing to find out. On the other side, I am also related to a number of Quaker abolitionists from the same time through a different side of the family. So we really do have both sides, I guess. Story 59. I had 2 distant relatives who were brother and sister and were separated during an Indian raid. About 10 years later, they reconnected in a small town and started dating before realizing they were related. They had a lot in common until they discovered just how much. I also had 2 ancestors who fought in the Civil War, including one who fought against Quantrill and Jesse James in the bloody Kansas versus Missouri skirmishes. Story 60. As a Pennsylvania girl, I never knew that part of my maternal family lived in the Deep South. After extensive research, I tracked down an Irish ancestor who landed in Norfolk, Virginia, in 1665. The surprising part is learning that one branch of the family were landowners and also owned slaves. I deeply wish this were not true. Story 61. My 12th great-grandfather was a German duke, so I am related to most of the royalty of Europe as well as a few National Socialists. The disturbing part is that I never received any money from them. My second great-grandfather owned slaves, fought as a colonel under Andrew Jackson, then was elected to the Virginia legislature and helped enact Jim Crow laws. He coincidentally fought against the United States Cavalry unit I would later serve in during Operation Desert Storm. Story 62. My dad owned a stone mine and pressured his drivers to work overtime with their trucks overloaded, which resulted in a crash that killed an entire bus of people. He managed to bribe his way out of trouble, and the driver was the only one prosecuted. Story 63. An ancestor a few hundred years ago, who is unsurprisingly from a dead branch of the family tree, had inappropriate relations with a sheep. This was not a rustling incident, as our family owned many sheep. No, he just liked sheep a lot. Mom kind of regretted using Ancestry.com for a while. Story 64. One of my close relatives works at border control for a country with a heavy cartel and organized crime presence. I am convinced he is deeply involved in drug smuggling across the border and regularly receives large payouts. He even has original art pieces in his house. Many other family members are also involved with the cartel. I only recently figured this out because it is not discussed at any family events I attend. It is still wild to think about. Story 65. Found letters between a Southern ancestor and his brother, in which they discussed the people they enslaved. I think one of those people might have been the son of the man who enslaved him. I knew it, but seeing it in their own handwriting was quite horrific. The one good thing was that the enslaved child had apparently been captured during the war along with the white son of the letter writer and was working for a Union officer. It reads very much like he escaped as soon as he got the chance and then convinced some Southern prisoners that he was spying and would definitely come back to South Carolina. I hope he went on to have a happy and successful life in the North. Story 66. My great-grandma was a violent schizophrenic. She cut off one of her ears, pointed a shotgun at my grandma while she was asleep, held my mom hostage at knife point when she was a little kid, and slit her own throat twice. She survived. Granny had many scars. I believe she ended up in a psychiatric ward or an old folks' home. My other great-grandma was a Cherokee Native American during a time when natives were widely discriminated against. She was 14 when she was married off to the town Catch, a man in his 20s whom everyone loved. She was considered very lucky for the match, but his family never accepted her. He was an abusive man who would be gone for weeks at a time, always drunk, cheating whenever he could, extremely controlling, and uncaring toward their children. My grandma had to endure it in silence. He fit the stereotypical role of a drunk, demanding husband who insisted that dinner be on the table when he came home and that his wife never speak. When she got sick later in life, he cut off all her hair, claiming it would be easier to manage short hair despite her pleas not to. For those unaware, hair is very important in most Native American cultures. The best thing that man ever did was die before she did, allowing her a couple of decades of freedom. She was also a very skilled artist, which we only discovered after she passed. She lived a quiet and subdued life. Story 67. I've traced my genealogy back to the 1300s in some lines. I nearly quit the hobby when I discovered an ancestor who owned a plantation in the American South. As a Canadian, I wasn't expecting that. It was an evil place according to the history I found. It really affected me to realize I shared any amount of DNA with someone like that. I still have to grapple with the thought sometimes. In all my ancestry, he is the only person on the wrong side of history, and it hits hard every time I think about it. Story 68. Well, it is ancient family history. After my sister did a DNA ancestry test, the results came back. One of our earliest ancestors to come from Europe was a slave owner in Virginia in the late 1600s to early 1700s. Story 69. My father was involved in a cocaine deal with two of my childhood heroes. Actually, his friend was the cocaine dealer. He was just the enforcer. My father was a big guy, former military, and I guess he brought a gun. It was strange to find out because he was not a drug person at all. Also, I did not learn about it until after he passed away, so I could not ask him about it. Story 70. My dad is a direct descendant of one of the largest slave owners in the Caribbean. The family owned 3,865 slaves altogether. Story 71. My great-grandfather came to America from a small village near Palermo, Sicily, in the 1910s. He got a job in Chicago working with other Sicilians. After a couple of years, he had enough money not only to send for the rest of the family but also to open a bar in Milwaukee. You can put two and two together on this one. Story 72. Not me, but a friend was able to trace his lineage back to Edward the Longshanks. It was common for me to dismiss his arguments with, "Well, your family killed Braveheart, so..." Story 73. Most of my birth family were killed in Lebanon for being Christian. That is why they are so dysfunctional. On my grandfather's side, all 7 members were killed except for him. He was the only survivor. On my grandmother's side, 3 siblings were killed along with their families. Story 74. Not really disturbing, just kind of interesting, I guess. The last name I got from my father is fairly unique. It was also the same as my maternal grandmother's maiden name, so the odds are there was some crossover before me. I did some research, and it turns out that my ancestry split back in the 1600s and rejoined at me. Story 75. My great-grandfather was a Spanish captain who fought in the Uruguay-Brazil War. At the end of the war, Brazil hanged all the Uruguay officers they could capture. My great-grandfather was captured but was not hanged. There was no need for him to be hanged. He was too out of his mind to fight again. A couple of years later, he recovered, moved to Brazil, and started a family. Sadly, the past caught up with him, and he ended his life in an asylum. Story 76. Owned a plantation and enslaved people. He was a high-ranking Confederate colonel who oversaw the supply trains for the South. Story 77. I can't say it was disturbing, but rather sad. When I was researching my ancestry, I found that my great-great-grandmother was arrested for stealing shoes when they came to the United States in the late 1800s. It is sad because they could not afford shoes. Story 78. Found an old document belonging to my direct paternal ancestor from the late 1600s where he had purchased a slave. Story 79. My great-grandfather was murdered by a family member using arsenic, which was very popular in the 1800s. He was 98, and there was not much to inherit. He was just a difficult man. One of my great-grandfathers divorced his wife to marry his stepdaughter. The divorce was considered far more scandalous than him marrying a 14-year-old, whom he had been raising as his daughter for several years. My grandfather deserted from the army and was living under an assumed name when my mother was born. Another great-grandfather came home from World War I, fell into alcoholism, abused his wife and daughters, and eventually hanged himself in my barn. My grandmother found the body. Yes, the family has a complicated history. Story 80. Their treatment in residential schools, being taken away from their native families to be assimilated and abused. Story 81. My grandmother had an affair with another man and had to go away for months to give birth in secret because her lover was black. My grandmother was white. My grandmother and I are the only ones who know, as my mother told me before she passed away. To this day, my grandmother is now 88. Story 82. Have you heard about Project 1619? I think my ancestors owned one of the first enslaved people. I am horrified. Story 83. My mother's biological father was 13 years older than my grandmother. This was not uncommon in the 1960s. However, he was a rapist and extremely abusive. My mother once mentioned that he set our house on fire. There is a newspaper article about it, but I do not believe he was ever charged with arson. When we did ancestry research, we discovered he had been married before meeting my grandmother and had a son from that marriage. This son is 19 years older than my mother. It is possible he never actually married my grandmother and simply ran off with her, abandoning his son from the previous marriage. Alternatively, he may have been so abusive that his first wife had enough self-respect to leave him. The truth is unknown. Story 84. My dad's cousin was sentenced to death by hanging in Malaysia for smuggling heroin in the 1980s. My dad visited him in prison. It was a very big deal at the time. Story 85. I'm not sure it's disturbing, but it was shocking when it came out. My grandmother was one of 12. Her oldest sibling turned out to be the second oldest. My great-grandparents had a relationship when she was 15 and he was 22. She got pregnant, and her parents forced her to give the baby up. They stayed together and got married a few years later, going on to have 11 more children. They tried for a long time to find their firstborn but faced many roadblocks. And since it was over 100 years ago, they had few resources to continue searching. When the firstborn was about 50 years old, the secret was discovered. She found not only her biological family but nearly a dozen siblings, and learned that her parents wanted her and tried to look for her. Apparently, she had an okay life with her adoptive family, but it was a shock to everyone. Sadly, she then died at 67 from a sudden aneurysm. Story 86. My great-aunt ran a brothel in Miami during the 1950s. She referred to the women as nurses and traveled with them throughout the Southeast, setting up shop in hotels during conventions. Later in her life, she also operated a legitimate nurse-for-hire service. My mother had always been ashamed of the prostitution aspect and hid it from us until we were adults and the aunt had passed away. Learning more about her, I realized she came from poverty and was an orphan at a time when there were very few employment options for women. I want to believe she helped other women with limited options find community and support one another. Story 87. Far from the most disturbing thing to happen in my family, I want to share this because it is still very strange nonetheless. My father recently revealed to me that he had a great uncle who would buy warts. The children would give him a quarter if they had a wart. He would say a prayer, and the wart would go away. Story 88. My granddad had one sister and two brothers, but he also had another sister that no one mentioned or talked about. I found out when I was 12 or 13 after overhearing a conversation between my mum and auntie. I did some digging and discovered from my mum that she had been in care her entire life. She was born severely disabled, unable to talk, and had the mental age of a baby. Amazingly, despite her disability, she outlived my granddad, who died at 81. I was the only family member who ever met her or saw her after she had been placed in care. I visited her in the care home without anyone knowing until she was moved when the care home closed, and I couldn't find her. I couldn't visit often as she was far away, and I had to take the train with no money and no one I could tell who would take me, as the family still insisted on pretending she didn't exist. The last time I managed to get there, I found the care home closed. This was before the internet, but I checked recently and found that the care home relocated. She didn't have anyone listed as next of kin, and the staff didn't know how to contact me. We only found out she had passed away when someone from the care home tracked down my mum to sort out the funeral expenses. By then, there were no siblings left. It always made me sad that she had no one, and that's why I tried to visit her. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.